Hey guys, tonight we're slipping on our finest togas, reclining on an absurdly expensive couch, and diving headfirst into the glittering, ridiculous, and surprisingly disgusting world of the filthy rich in ancient Rome. Not the senators giving speeches version, not the sandals and sunshine version they sell you on travel posters. I mean the real thing, the marble-floored, slave-staffed, dormouse-eating, vomiting between courses version of wealthy Roman life. So before you get comfortable, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a massive, heartfelt thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. Seriously, your ideas are what keep this channel alive, and every comment, every suggestion means the world. I read them all. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you prefer to drift off through your earbuds, the link is in the description. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's somehow always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Now dim the lights, put a fan on for that soft white noise, and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up, wiggle your toes, you've earned this. Let's take a moment, because before we go any further, I need you to ask yourself some questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be obscenely rich in a civilization that didn't have running water in most houses, but somehow did have heated floors? Have you ever thought about what you'd eat for dinner if money was no object but refrigeration hadn't been invented yet? Would you enjoy being bathed by a servant, or would that be the most awkward Tuesday of your life? Did Roman billionaires have bad days? Did they stress about their weight, their reputation, their neighbour's bigger fountain? Could you survive a dinner party that lasted 6 hours, involved at least 4 courses of things you'd rather not identify, and ended with someone definitely throwing up into a decorative pot? And what about the slaves, the hundreds of them, running every corner of your life from your morning wake-up call to the person whose entire job was to remind you that you were mortal? Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Rome. The year is somewhere around the 1st century. You're fabulously, obscenely, almost comically wealthy. You have a house the size of a small village, more servants than you can name, and a lifestyle so extravagant it would make a modern hedge fund manager feel slightly underdressed. Your back doesn't hurt, your toga is freshly pressed, and somewhere in the kitchen, someone is already preparing something expensive and deeply questionable for your breakfast. Welcome to the good life, Roman style. Let's find out how good it actually was. Let's start where your day starts. Home. And for the wealthy Roman, home wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a monument to your own importance, a carefully engineered statement of power, taste, and the fact that you had more money than most of the known world would ever see. The Roman domus, the private home of the elite, was less a house and more an experience. From the street it looked almost modest, deceptively so, just a blank-faced wall and a heavy wooden door. But step inside and the world cracked open. A long corridor called the Forces, Latin for throat, which is unsettling, opened into the atrium, a grand central hall with a rectangular pool in the floor called the impluvium, designed to catch rainwater from a hole in the roof above. Marble columns lined the space. Frescoes covered every wall in vivid reds, yellows and greens. Mosaics on the floor depicted gods, sea creatures, and scenes of battle with a level of artistry that would take a modern craftsman years to recreate. And this was just the entrance hall. Beyond the atrium lay the tablinum, where the master of the house conducted business, a kind of ancient home office, except your home. Office had marble floors and a view of a colonnaded garden. Further still was the peristyle, a large inner courtyard open to the sky, ringed with columns, planted with clipped hedges, roses and herbs, centred on a fountain that burbled pleasantly all day. Statues posed dramatically in the corners. The smell of garden flowers drifted through the colonnade. Birds were sometimes kept in a dedicated aviary. It was the kind of garden that made guests feel slightly inadequate about their own homes, which was precisely the point, and the house kept going. There were triclinia, plural dining rooms, because one wasn't enough, decorated according to season or occasion. There were cubicular, private bedrooms for family and honoured guests. There were libraries. There were dedicated storage rooms, wine cellars, kitchens tucked out of sight and smell in the rear of the house, and separate quarters for the dozens or hundreds of slaves who kept the entire operation running. Some of the grandest homes in Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by volcanic ash in the most terrible kind of time capsule, have given archaeologists an almost uncomfortably intimate look at this world. Room after room, each with its own painted walls, garden after garden, fountain after fountain. What's remarkable is how deliberately the house was designed to communicate status to visitors before a single word was spoken. You walk through the entrance and your eye was drawn immediately down the long axis of the house, through the atrium, through the tablinum, all the way to the garden at the back. This was not accidental. The Romans understood what architects call a vista, and they used it the same way some people use a very expensive car, to make sure you understood exactly who you were dealing with. The more your eye could travel, the richer the owner. Wealthy Romans also decorated their floors with mosaics that were almost shockingly sophisticated, tiny chips of coloured stone, glass and shell, arranged into images of fish, gods, hunting scenes, and geometric patterns with a precision that required years of skilled labour. One famous mosaic from a Pompeian house shows a chained dog at the entrance with the words "Cave Canem" beneath it. Beware of the dog. Even the welcome mat was a flex. Your house was not just where you lived. It was your argument for existing at the level you claimed. Every column, every fountain, every carefully painted wall said the same thing in the universal language of real estate. I arrived, and I stayed. You don't wake yourself up. That would be embarrassing. In the home of a wealthy Roman, waking up is a team sport, involving at minimum 2 or 3 personal attendants, and probably a cockerel somewhere outside that nobody asked for. The Roman elite rose early, disgracefully early by modern standards, often at or just before sunrise. But unlike the medieval peasant crawling out of a flea-infested straw pile and immediately beginning the long, miserable process of not dying, you wake up in a bed called a lectus, raised off the floor, fitted with a proper mattress stuffed with wool or feathers, covered in fine linens and blankets. It is, by ancient standards, genuinely comfortable. Within moments of stirring your body slave, a personal attendant whose entire existence is organised around your needs is at your side. They bring water for your face, poured from a ceramic vessel into a shallow bowl. They help you into your undergarments, a simple loincloth called a sublegaculum, and then a linen tunic. They fetch your outer garments. All of this happens with a practiced efficiency that requires no instructions from you, because your morning routine is so fixed, so anticipated, that your household could execute it entirely without your participation. You are, in a very specific sense, an event that your slaves prepare for. Now comes the toga. The toga is, by any modern measure, a deeply impractical garment, a single unstitched piece of wool, roughly semicircular, somewhere between 14 and 20 feet across. It has to be folded and draped in a precise way, and it requires assistance to put on correctly. There is no pinning, no fastening. It is held in place by tension, drape, and the hope that you don't move too suddenly. 2 people are generally needed. The process takes several minutes of patient arrangement, tucking, adjusting, and stepping back to evaluate whether the folds fall correctly. Falling folds were a matter of genuine social concern. Cicero reportedly said that a man who couldn't manage his toga managed nothing. In summer, The toga is oppressively heavy and hot, a wool blanket wrapped around your entire body in the Mediterranean sun. In winter, it is dramatically insufficient, offering roughly the thermal protection of a large, expensive curtain. Most wealthy Romans wore it as rarely as they could get away with, slipping into a more comfortable and practical garment called the synthesis at home, and reserving the toga for public appearances where the social cost of being seen without it outweighed the physical cost of wearing it. Once dressed, you move through the house toward the atrium, where business will begin shortly. Along the way, you might pass slaves already at work, sweeping mosaic floors, trimming lamp wicks, carrying water, arranging flowers in the garden. The house is never silent. There is always movement, always activity, the low-level hum of an operation running on human labour at every hour of the day. You move through it the way a ship's captain moves through a working deck, present, acknowledged, essential, and almost entirely uninvolved in the actual labour. By the time you reach the atrium, your face is washed, your toga is arranged, and your attendants have retreated to precisely the right distance, close enough to be useful, far enough not to hover. You are, by the standards of your time, immaculately prepared, and the sun has barely cleared the rooftops. Your day has begun, whether you wanted it to or not. Before you've had a single bite of food, your morning takes a peculiar turn. Because here's something nobody tells you about being rich in ancient Rome. The moment you wake up, people are already waiting outside your door. A crowd of them. The salutatio was a daily ritual in which clients, people of lower social status who depended on your patronage, gathered at the homes of wealthy Romans at dawn to pay their respects, seek favours, ask for money, beg for legal help, or simply show up to be seen associating with someone important. It was a transactional relationship dressed up in the language of respect. They called you patron. You called them clients. They showed up every morning. You occasionally threw them a little cash called the sportula, a small handout that was sometimes literal food and sometimes actual coins. Think of it as the world's oldest and most humiliating networking event held in your own hallway, before coffee existed. The clients arrived in strict social order. The most important, perhaps a senator hoping for your support in some forthcoming political matter, or a wealthy merchant seeking your recommendation, came first and were admitted to the tablinum for a relatively private audience. Lesser clients followed in descending waves of importance, filling the atrium and spilling into the entrance corridor, standing in the early morning light waiting for their brief moment of access. Some had walked considerable distances through the streets of Rome before dawn to be here, because arriving late was a social failure and arriving first was an advertisement of your dedication. And the truly rich didn't just have dozens of clients, they had hundreds. On any given morning, the atrium of a powerful senator or successful general might hold more people than a small village. Each one required acknowledgement, a word, a nod, a promise, administered at a pace that was essentially an endurance sport. Your nomenclator, the slave whose specific job was to whisper the names of approaching visitors into your ear, worked continuously throughout the salutatio, ensuring you never had to suffer the indignity of visibly forgetting who someone was. It is worth pausing on this. There was a person whose entire role in your household was to prevent you from looking socially awkward. Rome invented the personal PR handler 2,000 years before the job description existed. For the clients, the salutatio was simultaneously necessary and demeaning. It was necessary because access to a powerful patron was how things got done in Rome, legal disputes resolved, contracts obtained, reputations managed, political appointments secured. It was demeaning because you showed up, hat in hand before sunrise, to perform gratitude to someone who might barely remember your name despite the nomenclator's best efforts. The satirist Juvenal described clients trudging through dark streets in winter rain, arriving at the patron's door to receive the sportula, a few coins barely worth the walk before being dismissed and shuffling home to their cramped apartments, while the patron returned to his imported breakfast. The gap between the optics of the patron-client relationship and its reality was, Juvenal suggested, roughly the width of the Mediterranean. By the time the last client filed out, the sun was fully up, and your atrium smelled of the street. You had smiled, nodded, promised, deflected, and performed magnanimity for somewhere between 1 and 3 hours. Now, finally, it was time to eat. You deserved it. After the parade of supplicants had cleared your atrium, you finally got to eat. And here is where the story takes a turn you might not expect, because for all the grandeur of a Roman aristocrat's life, breakfast was deeply, almost insultingly unimpressive. The Romans called it ientaculum, and it was less a meal and more a suggestion of one, bread sometimes, dipped in olive oil, sometimes rubbed with garlic, sometimes crumbled into a cup of watered-down wine. Perhaps a handful of olives, maybe some cheese, dried fruit, a few nuts. That was it. No eggs Benedict, no coffee, obviously, no elaborate spread of pastries. The Romans, despite their reputation for legendary banquets, treated breakfast with the same energy most of us bring to filling out a form we didn't ask for. It was functional, fast, and largely joyless. The bread itself was at least good. Wealthy Romans ate white bread made from finely milled wheat, a genuine luxury in a world where most people ate coarser bread made from lower quality grain. The whiteness of your bread was, like most things in Rome, a status indicator. You could tell a great deal about someone's social position by what they were eating at the beginning of the day. A wealthy man eating white bread in his marble atrium. A labourer eating darker, denser barley bread in the street. Grain ran the Roman world in ways we don't fully appreciate from this distance. The whole system of grain supply, the annona, was a massive state operation ensuring that the city of Rome was fed, because a hungry Roman population was a dangerous Roman population, and everyone from emperors downward was aware of this. What you drank with your bread was typically wine, but not the good wine. The good wine was for dinner. Morning wine in a wealthy Roman home was the ordinary stuff, diluted with water in a ratio that made it barely wine at all. Calling it a breakfast cocktail would be generous. Calling it flavoured water with aspirations would be more accurate. Some Romans drank goat's milk in the morning, which was considered nourishing. Some drank water, if the household water supply was good. None of them drank anything that would have made a modern morning person feel understood. The Romans had 3 meals, ientaculum, prandium, and cena, but only one of them really counted. Prandium, the midday meal, was also quick and light. More bread, perhaps some cold meat, cheese, vegetables, fruit. Eaten standing or walking, often not at home at all. Roman public life didn't pause for a long lunch. The entire Roman culinary calendar was essentially organised as a slow build toward the evening meal, the cena, which was the only meal anyone put any actual thought into. Everything before dinner was maintenance. Dinner was the event. In the meantime, you ate your white bread, sipped your diluted wine, and glanced out at the garden. Somewhere in the kitchen, already, preparations for the evening meal were beginning. The cook, if you were wealthy enough to own a skilled one, and you were, was already calculating. What had been purchased at the market that morning? What did the master mention wanting? What could be obtained, prepared, presented, and arranged to demonstrate one more time that living in this house was worth every sestercic cost? The kitchen never really stopped, but breakfast, for all the wealth surrounding it, was still just bread. Let's talk about the part of wealthy Roman life that nobody in a toga likes to draw attention to, the machinery that made all of it run. Because behind every gleaming mosaic floor, every perfectly draped toga, every 6-course dinner, every scented bath, every message delivered across the city, every garden hedge trimmed into the shape of a peacock, there were slaves. hundreds of them in the homes of the truly wealthy. Some historians estimate that a prosperous Roman household might have owned anywhere from 50 to several hundred enslaved people, each with a specific role. There were slaves for cooking, for cleaning, for carrying litters, for reading aloud, for keeping accounts, for delivering letters, for managing other slaves, for styling hair, for massaging feet, for tasting food before it reached the master's plate. There was reportedly a slave whose sole function was to remind wealthy Romans of the names of people they were about to greet. This person was called a nomenclator, and honestly their job description sounds both incredibly stressful and deeply modern. Roman slavery was not a single uniform condition. It existed on a spectrum that makes it no less monstrous, but considerably more complex than popular imagination suggests. At one end were enslaved people doing brutal physical labour in mines and agricultural estates, under conditions that amounted to a slow death sentence. At the other end were highly educated slaves, often Greek, serving as tutors, physicians, architects, accountants, and personal secretaries to their owners. Some of these individuals held considerable effective power. The slave who managed a wealthy household's accounts controlled significant financial flows. The slave who educated a senator's children shaped future generations of Roman leadership. This did not make their enslavement acceptable. It made the system more insidious, because it created layers of apparent privilege that obscured the fundamental violence underneath. Slaves could be freed, manumission was a genuine feature of Roman society, and many enslaved people were freed upon their owner's death or as a reward for exceptional service. A freed slave became a libertus, a freedman with significant though not complete legal rights. Some freedmen became wealthy and influential in their own right. The satirist Petronius's fictional character Trimalchio, a fabulously rich, deeply vulgar freedman who hosts an absurd dinner party, is one of Roman literature's most vivid creations, and his presence in the narrative suggests that the social mobility of freed slaves was real enough to be culturally anxiety-inducing. But manumission was not generosity as we would understand it. It was calculated. It motivated enslaved workers through the distant possibility of freedom. It transferred ongoing social obligation from the freed slave to their former master. The patron-client system absorbed freedmen just as it absorbed everyone else. You were freed, and then you owed your former master for freeing you. The machinery of Roman society was remarkably good at converting every relationship into a ledger entry. The existence of this system doesn't sit comfortably alongside any portrait of Roman civilization as purely sophisticated, elegant, or admirable. The marble was real, the philosophy was real, the poetry was extraordinary. And none of it would have existed in the form it did without the labour of people who had no choice. The grandeur of Rome was, in the most direct and literal sense, built on human suffering at a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Any honest account of wealthy Roman life begins and ends there. You'd think that being rich enough to have people dress you would make the process pleasant, and in some ways it did. Your clothes were fine, genuinely fine, made from quality wool, sometimes silk imported at extraordinary expense from the East along the trade routes that connected Rome to China in a supply chain that would have impressed a modern logistics company. Sometimes linen bleached to a blinding white. The quality of your fabric communicated your position immediately and wordlessly to everyone who saw you, in the way that a very particular kind of watch does today. Colour communicated rank. A broad purple stripe called the latus clavus on your toga meant you were a senator. A narrow stripe, the angustus clavus, meant equestrian class. Full purple was reserved for the emperor alone, and wearing it without permission was not a fashion statement. It was a political one, with potentially fatal consequences. But for all the status your clothing conveyed, Actually wearing it was a different experience entirely. The toga was, by any modern measure, a deeply impractical garment designed by someone who had strong opinions about grandeur and apparently no opinions about comfort. Putting it on correctly required the assistance of at least 2 people and a practiced eye for drape. Once on, it could not be pinned. It was maintained entirely by tension and the careful balance of fabric weight. If you moved too suddenly, too enthusiastically, or sneezed at the wrong angle, sections of it shifted in ways that required immediate correction. Wearing a toga was less like wearing clothing and more like carrying an architectural feature of your house around your body all day. Beyond the toga, wealthy Romans maintained wardrobes of considerable variety. Undergarments, tunics of varying weights for different seasons, cloaks called the pennula or lacerna for cold or wet weather, soft leather shoes called calce whose specific style indicated social rank. Boots were for soldiers and travellers. Sandals were casual. The calce worn by senators had a specific design, with a crescent-shaped buckle, distinct from equestrian footwear. Even your shoes were a document. Hair was another production. Wealthy Roman men kept their hair cut short and their faces shaved by a barber, never themselves, because the razor was a serious tool in inexperienced hands, and Roman barbers were, according to the poet Martial, sometimes only marginally better than inexperienced. A bad shave was a recurring complaint in Roman literature. Wealthy women, meanwhile, achieved hairstyles of spectacular complexity. Elaborate arrangements of curls, braids, and waves built over frames and supported with hairpins, sometimes incorporating hairpieces from enslaved women or purchased on the open market. A woman's ornatrix, her hair slave, was a specialist whose skills were valued and whose mistakes were apparently dealt with harshly. All of this clothing, all of this grooming took time. A significant portion of a wealthy Roman's morning was devoted to being prepared, presented and polished before appearing in public. The Roman street was an audience, and you were always performing. The toga was uncomfortable, unpinned, and prone to spectacular malfunction. But it was yours. It was white. It had the right stripe, and when the morning light caught the fabric as you stepped out of your front door, you looked, whatever else might be said, exactly like what you were. Of all the things a wealthy Roman did in a day, perhaps nothing consumed more time, more money, or more social energy than bathing. The baths, the thermae, were the Roman equivalent of a gym, a spa, a business networking event, and a gossip exchange, all rolled into one steaming, marble-clad building that smelled aggressively of oil and other people. Even wealthy Romans with private baths at home used the great public thermae, because the public baths were not merely practical, they were magnificent. The baths of Caracalla, completed in the early 3rd century, could accommodate perhaps 1,600 bathers simultaneously in a complex covering more than 30 acres. It had libraries, it had gardens, it had shops. Calling it a bathhouse is like calling the Colosseum a stadium. Technically true misses the point entirely. The bathing sequence moved through a series of rooms of graduated temperature. You began in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you stripped and handed your clothes to a slave or paid an attendant to watch them. Theft in the baths was a known problem, and the subject of several surviving Roman jokes and complaints. Then came the frigidarium, the cold room with its cold plunge pool, bracing and sharp. Then the tepidarium, warm and humid, where you began to sweat gently. And finally the caldarium, the hot room, thick with steam, where the temperature was aggressive enough to make conversation laborious and thought optional. You moved through these rooms at whatever pace pleased you, and the whole sequence could easily consume an afternoon. In place of soap, wealthy Romans applied olive oil to their skin, allowed it to mix with sweat and dirt, and then had it scraped off with a curved metal instrument called a strigil. The strigil was a standard piece of personal equipment carried to the baths the way a modern person carries a gym bag. The scraping process removed the oil along with whatever had accumulated on the skin during the day, which was, in the pre-antiperspirant world of ancient Rome, quite a lot. The resulting substance scraped from athletes' bodies was apparently collected and sold as a medicinal product. This tells you something about Roman medicine that we'll return to later. The social dimension of the baths was, for wealthy Romans, almost the primary one. Business was conducted, political alliances were negotiated. Gossip moved through the steam rooms at a pace that made the forum look slow. You met people, you were seen, you performed health and leisure in the specific Roman way that transformed relaxation into another form of professional activity. Even swimming naked in a heated pool with a senator was somehow a networking opportunity. The wealthy also maintained private baths within their homes, a suite of heated rooms fed by a hypocauste system, the underfloor heating technology that the Romans used throughout their finest buildings. The floors sat above a raised platform through which hot air from a furnace circulated, heating the stone from below. Walking on a Roman hypocauste floor in winter was a genuinely extraordinary sensory experience. Warmth rising through your feet in a building that was otherwise fully exposed to the Roman winter. It was the closest thing to central heating the ancient world produced, and it worked. Beautifully. The coal bill must have been staggering. Now we arrive at the centerpiece of wealthy Roman life, the event around which the entire day was essentially a waiting room, the cena, or dinner party. Roman aristocrats did not eat dinner the way you eat dinner. They didn't sit at a table with plates and politely pass things around. They reclined, lying on their left side on low couches called triclinia arranged around a central low table, propped on cushions, eating with their right hand, leaning on their left elbow in a posture that sounds comfortable in theory, and after about 40 minutes begins to produce a specific kind of shoulder pain that no amount of wine fully addresses. 3 couches per arrangement, 3 people per couch, 9 guests per dining cluster, in a room also called the triclinium. The reclined position was the mark of a civilized person at leisure. Standing to eat was for people with no options, no table, and no social imagination. The meal was structured in acts. The gustatio was the appetizer course. Eggs, vegetables, salted fish, olives, seafood, mushrooms, light things to open the appetite and give guests something to do while latecomers arrived and the wine was brought out. Then came the prima mensa, the main courses, plural and serious. Then dessert, the secunda mensa, fruit, nuts, honey cakes, pastries. And then, often, the drinking party, the commissatio, which continued after the food ended and involved toasting in amounts determined by a drinking master appointed for the evening, whose specific job was to manage how drunk everyone got, a responsibility that clearly required wisdom and was frequently discharged poorly. The whole event lasted hours. 6 was not unusual. 8 was not impossible for a particularly ambitious host. During the meal there was music, a small ensemble playing in an adjoining room or corner, providing atmosphere without demanding attention. There might be poetry recited, or a reading from a recent literary work. There might be dancers or acrobats performing between courses, deployed like living palate cleansers between the stuffed dormice and the flamingo. Guests were expected to contribute wit, opinion, and cultured conversation. Sitting silently at a Roman dinner party was considered antisocial. You were there to perform as much as to eat. The kitchen, meanwhile, was operating under conditions that would close a modern restaurant within the hour. Roman kitchens were small, poorly ventilated, and equipped with open hearths and portable braziers that filled the space with smoke and heat. A cook preparing multiple elaborate courses for 9 or more guests was working at full stretch for most of the day before the party began. The koki, the cook, was among the most valued and expensive slaves in a wealthy household, because good cooking was considered a skilled art, and bad cooking was a social catastrophe. The satirist Petronius describes a dinner so extravagant that it essentially bankrupted its host's dignity while impressing nobody. The Romans understood the difference between impressive and actually good. Ideally, your dinner party was both. Often it was just expensive. Let's talk about what was actually on the table, because Roman aristocratic food is a subject that rewards close attention and also a certain amount of controlled bewilderment. The Romans loved flavour the way some people love argument, with excessive enthusiasm and absolutely no sense of restraint. And the centrepiece of almost everything they cooked was garum, a fermented fish sauce produced by layering whole fish, guts included, with large quantities of salt in open clay containers, leaving the entire arrangement in the sun for weeks or months until the fish liquefied, and then straining off the resulting amber liquid into ceramic bottles. The smell during production was, according to ancient sources, remarkable enough that garum factories were banned from certain areas of Roman cities. The end product tasted something like extremely concentrated anchovy paste combined with soy sauce, and the Romans poured it on almost everything with an enthusiasm that suggests they had permanently recalibrated their palates. Garum was not the same for everyone. There were grades. The finest garum, made from mackerel produced in specific coastal towns aged correctly, was extraordinarily expensive and stored in small, precious amphorae the way modern collectors treat aged vinegar. Inferior grades were cheap and abundant. Your garum communicated your wealth. At the high end of Roman culinary ambition, it was combined with wine, honey, spices, and herbs in sauces of Byzantine complexity that have been reconstructed by modern food historians with mixed results. Beyond the sauce, the Roman aristocratic table featured dishes that required either a very open mind or a very closed nose. Stuffed dormouse, the glyas, a small rodent fattened in a special ceramic container called a gladiatorium, kept in darkness and fed on nuts until sufficiently plump, then roasted and served with honey and poppy seeds, appears in enough sources to confirm that it was genuinely a wealthy person's delicacy, and not a piece of ancient satire that got out of hand. Flamingo was eaten, prepared with dates and pepper. Ostrich was boiled and served in spiced wine sauce. Sea urchins, jellyfish, roasted songbirds, sow's womb, peacock. The wealthy Roman table was an exercise in the culinary philosophy that if something existed and could be caught, it could probably be eaten, and if it was sufficiently exotic, it could be served to guests. Spices were extraordinarily expensive and used with aristocratic abandon. Pepper imported from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, silphium, a plant from North Africa that the Romans loved so much they appear to have driven it to extinction through overconsumption, which is a very on-brand Roman way to lose a species. Salt was valuable enough to factor into soldiers' pay. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, related to salt. You were, in the most literal possible sense, worth your salt. The point of all this exotic consumption was not purely pleasure, it was performance. A Roman dinner party menu was a list of coordinates demonstrating your wealth, your connections, your access to global trade networks, and your willingness to spend extravagantly. If your guests could identify every ingredient, you hadn't spent enough. The Romans drank wine the way we drink water, with the crucial distinction that they generally diluted it with water first, because drinking wine undiluted was considered barbaric. Literally, it was something barbarians did, according to the Romans, who had thoughts about barbarians the way some people today have thoughts about people who eat pineapple on pizza. Strong, consistent, and slightly disproportionate. The dilution ratio varied by occasion, company, and the ambitions of whoever was hosting. Typically 2 parts wine to 3 parts water. though the ratio shifted at evening parties in a direction that explained many of the next morning's political incidents. But Roman wine wasn't what we'd recognise today. It was often thick, almost syrupy, frequently sweet, and commonly resinous, preserved with pine resin in the storage amphorae, which gave it a flavour note that modern wine drinkers would describe as interesting before quietly setting the glass down. It was sometimes smoked. Sometimes seawater was added during production, which sounds like an act of hostility against the drink itself, but was apparently considered a preservative technique. It was frequently boiled down into a concentrated syrup called defrutum, which was then used as a sweetener and flavour additive in cooking and sauce making, or reconstituted with water into mulsum, a honey-sweetened wine served at the beginning of dinner to greet the appetite. Lead played a significant and troubling role in Roman wine culture. Roman winemakers discovered that boiling grape juice or wine in lead vessels produced a sweet syrup called sapa, which improved flavour and preservation. They used it extensively. Modern toxicologists looking at Roman skeletal remains have found elevated lead levels consistent with chronic poisoning. Some historians have theorised that widespread lead exposure from wine vessels and plumbing may have contributed to cognitive and behavioural issues among the Roman elite, which is either a deeply sobering historical observation or the most spectacular single food safety failure in Western history, depending on your perspective. The wealthiest Romans collected aged wines from prestigious regional appellations with the obsessive specificity of modern fine wine enthusiasts. The wines of Falernian, Caecuban, and Massic regions were considered among the finest in the Roman world. Vintages were discussed, debated, and served at dinner with theatrical ceremony, the wine brought out in a sealed amphora, opened in front of guests, the vintage announced. Serving an inferior wine to important guests was a social insult. Serving your finest wine to people of lower status was considered wasteful, possibly suspicious. Roman social life, like Roman wine, required precise calibration between generosity and calculation, and the wine never really stopped. It appeared at breakfast, diluted to the point of suggestion. It accompanied the midday snack. It flowed through dinner for hours. It continued through the commissatio that followed. The Romans were not alcoholics by their own cultural framework. They were people for whom the consumption of wine was so structurally embedded in daily life that the absence of it would have felt like the absence of gravity. The question was never whether to drink. The question was always what, how much, and with whom. Even those answers in Rome were matters of rank. We need to address the vomitorium, because it is one of history's most resilient misconceptions, and it is deeply entertaining that it exists at all. The Roman vomitorium was not, repeat, not, a designated room where wealthy diners went to vomit between courses so they could return and eat more. It did not exist for this purpose. A vomitorium was an architectural term for the passages in an amphitheatre, or large venue through which crowds could quickly exit, disgorging people the way the Romans thought. The building was vomiting them out. That's it. That was the whole thing. You could fit the entire truth of the vomitorium into a single sentence, and yet here we are, 2,000 years later, still explaining it to people who saw it in a documentary and decided it was the most interesting fact about Rome they'd ever heard. However, the Romans at extravagant dinner parties absolutely did sometimes purge between courses. The historian Seneca mentions it with the weary disapproval of a man who has seen too much. He describes wealthy Romans eating until full, then relieving themselves in order to eat more, and finds the practice morally repugnant, not because of the physical act, but because of what it represented, the total subordination of self-control to appetite. For Seneca, a committed Stoic who wrote extensively about the importance of simplicity while personally owning multiple estates, this was too far. Even by Roman standards, occasional deliberate purging at dinner was considered excessive, a mark of someone who had confused abundance with discipline. The Emperor Claudius reportedly considered issuing a decree allowing flatulence at dinner, prompted by a report that a guest had made himself seriously ill by holding it in throughout a meal out of social delicacy. Whether or not Claudius actually drafted this decree, and ancient sources are not always reliable narrators, the fact that the story circulated says something about how Romans thought about the relationship between bodily function and social performance. The answer broadly was awkwardly. What actually happened at long Roman dinner parties between courses was considerably less dramatic than the vomitorium myth suggests. Guests used chamber pots, provided discreetly by slaves, without leaving the dining room. They rinsed their hands between courses, bowls of scented water were passed around regularly. They reclined and rested while entertainment was provided, the pace of a Roman. Dinner was genuinely slow, measured in hours, with deliberate pauses between courses that allowed digestion to proceed at a civilized pace before the next elaborate presentation arrived. It was not a race to consume as much as possible. It was a performance of leisure. The persistence of the vomitorium myth tells us something interesting about how we imagine excess. We want Roman wealth to have been grotesque, unhinged, physically extreme, and the reality is complicated enough that inventing a dedicated purging room feels like it fits. But the truth is that Roman aristocratic dining, while certainly extravagant and occasionally bizarre by modern standards, was also a highly choreographed social ritual with its own rules of comportment. You were expected to eat well, drink measurably, converse wittily, and not disgrace yourself or your host. The theatre of Roman dining was about controlled display, not abandonment. Mostly. There were exceptions. There were always exceptions. The Emperor Vitellius, who reportedly consumed 4 enormous meals daily and was eventually executed while apparently still thinking about lunch, was considered embarrassing even by his contemporaries. The Romans could recognize excess when they saw it. They just didn't always agree on where the line was. A wealthy Roman dinner party was not just about food. It was theatre. The host was the director, the food was the set, and the entertainment was the cast, and the cast could be extraordinary or extraordinarily awkward depending on the night and the budget. Musicians played throughout the meal. Flutes and lyres were the standard accompaniment, providing a layer of ambient sound that filled silences and covered the noise of slaves moving between courses. The music was not meant to be listened to the way a modern audience listens to a concert. It was meant to be felt, the way background music in a restaurant is meant to make you feel that something pleasant is happening even when the conversation has stalled. Dancers moved between the couches at appropriate intervals. Acrobats performed feats of flexibility in the spaces between tables, contorting themselves into positions that made guests simultaneously impressed and concerned about the structural integrity of the human spine. Fire jugglers appeared at grander parties. Trained animals, bears, exotic birds, occasionally small monkeys, were sometimes deployed as novelty entertainment by hosts who wanted to be remembered. The satirist Petronius's fictional host Trimalchio, in his absurdly over-the-top dinner party described in the Satyricon, deploys an entire sequence of theatrical surprises, including a mechanical skeleton, a recitation from Homer performed by servants, and a wild boar dressed in a freedman's hat. The comedy of Petronius is rooted in the recognizable reality that wealthy Romans competed aggressively on the entertainment front. But the entertainment that occupied the most social energy was conversation itself, and the figure brought in to anchor it was the philosopher. Some wealthy Romans kept a resident philosopher on staff, a tame intellectual available for stimulating dinner dialogue, functioning like a very educated house accessory. The philosopher was expected to provide the dinner with intellectual credibility, to raise interesting questions, to demonstrate that the evening was not merely about food and display, but about the life of the mind. This put the philosopher in a position of considerable social difficulty. Too provocative, and the host was embarrassed in front of his guests. Too compliant, and he was obviously a paid flatterer earning his meal. The ideal philosopher hit a precise middle register of thoughtful challenge that stimulated conversation without destabilizing the room. It was an almost impossible brief. Guests were not passive. They were expected to contribute, to quote poetry from memory, to offer opinions on current events in polished Latin, to match wits with whoever was performing opposite them. A man who sat silently through a Roman dinner party was a social failure. A man who talked too much and listened too little was worse. The conversational ideal was the well-timed observation, something that moved the table's discussion forward while reflecting credit on the speaker. Cicero, whose wit was famous enough to survive in written collections, understood this perfectly. He was, by all accounts, brilliant company. He was also, by all accounts, occasionally insufferable, which suggests that even in ancient Rome the line between excellent conversationalist and person who thinks they're excellent company was thin and frequently crossed. The evening's entertainment culminated not in the food but in the commissatio, the drinking party that followed the meal, where the entertainment became looser, the wine less diluted, and the behaviour of guests increasingly at variance with the studied elegance of the earlier courses. What began as theatre ended as improvisation. Rome at midnight was a different city from Rome at noon, and a Roman dinner party at its end looked considerably different from a Roman dinner party at its beginning. For the wealthy Roman, culture was not something you simply enjoyed. It was something you deployed. Owning fine art, patronising poets, commissioning sculptures, demonstrating fluency in Greek philosophy, these were not hobbies. They were components of your public identity, as carefully managed as your toga and your client list. Rome had a complicated and slightly anxious relationship with Greek civilization, which had been militarily conquered but never quite culturally digested. The Romans had marched into Greece and come home carrying crates of Greek sculpture, scrolls of Greek philosophy, and a nagging awareness that the people they had just defeated had built something culturally extraordinary that Rome wanted very much to own. The result was a wholesale importation of Greek aesthetic values into Roman aristocratic life. Greek sculptures filled Roman atria and gardens, originals when you could get them, copies when you couldn't, though the copies were produced with such skill that modern museums have spent centuries arguing about which is which. Greek tutors educated Roman children, teaching them to read and write in Greek alongside Latin, because a man who couldn't quote Homer in the original was considered only partially educated. Greek philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, the Platonic tradition was studied, discussed, and very publicly associated with at dinner parties by men who then went home and behaved in ways that would have baffled most philosophers. Poetry was patronised with genuine seriousness. The great poets of the Augustan age, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, depended on the financial support of wealthy men, most famously Gaius Maecenas, the advisor and intimate of the Emperor Augustus, who understood that funding excellent poetry was itself a form of political and cultural power. Maecenas gave Virgil and Horace the financial security to write without needing to earn a living, and in return received, among other things, the Aeneid, the founding epic of Rome that legitimized the Augustan political project in verse of extraordinary beauty. It was the most successful arts patronage arrangement in Western history, and everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing. Visual art was collected with competitive intensity. Paintings, large panel paintings and frescoes, decorated every room of a wealthy home. Some wealthy Romans collected with the systematic acquisitiveness of modern hedge fund billionaires, purchasing entire collections, outbidding rivals for famous works, commissioning portraits and decorative schemes from the best craftsmen available. Pliny the Elder devoted significant portions of his natural history to discussions of famous painters and sculptors, and his tone, breathless, reverential, occasionally scandalized by the prices paid, reads remarkably like a modern art world profile. What unified all of it was the understanding that taste was power. The right painting in the right atrium, the right poet at your dinner table, the right philosophical affiliation quoted at the right moment. These were the signals by which Roman aristocratic society sorted itself. Culture in Rome was currency. The wealthy Romans who understood this best were the ones who shaped the era. The ones who got it wrong ended up as the butt of Juvenal's satirical verse, which was its own kind of immortality, just not the kind anyone wanted. For a civilization that produced so much philosophy and architecture, the Romans were also intensely, almost frightening enthusiastic about chariot racing. The Circus Maximus in Rome stretched roughly 600 meters in length and could hold, depending on which ancient source you trust and how generously you interpret the seating arrangements, somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators. To put that in modern terms, it was the largest sports venue that has ever existed by a considerable margin in a city of perhaps 1 million people. On race days, roughly 1 in 4 Romans was watching chariots. The sound must have been extraordinary. The smell was certainly extraordinary, though in a different direction. Chariot racing was organised into 4 factions: the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites. Each faction was a fully operational sporting organisation with stables, trainers, veterinarians, mechanics, responsible for maintaining the chariots, and substantial financial backing from wealthy supporters. The factions had their own colours, their own fan bases, their own rivalries, and their own political implications. In later Roman and Byzantine history, chariot faction allegiance became entangled with theological disputes and occasionally produced riots. People who think modern sports, tribalism is uniquely contemporary have simply not read enough about the greens and blues. Wealthy Romans back their factions financially and emotionally, with an abandon they rarely permitted themselves in other social contexts. A senator who maintained perfect stoic composure in the forum might be found screaming himself hoarse in his circus box when the greens took a corner badly. Bets were placed at stakes that would have alarmed a modern financial regulator. Accusations of race fixing, chariot sabotage, and the poisoning of rival horses appear regularly enough in Roman sources to suggest these were not isolated incidents, but standard features of the competitive landscape. The drivers themselves occupied a fascinating social position. Most were enslaved men or freedmen, legally among the lowest in Roman society. Yet a successful charioteer could become genuinely famous, showered with prize money, public adoration, and the specific celebrity that attaches to people who do something extraordinary and dangerous in front of large crowds. The charioteer Gaius Apuleius Diocles, who raced in the 2nd century, accumulated winnings over his career that have been calculated, using various methodologies, to be equivalent to several billion modern dollars. He retired at the age of 42, which in chariot racing terms was an age normally associated with either extraordinary luck or extraordinary skill, possibly both. For the wealthy Roman spectator, the circus was also a social venue. The seating was by rank, the best seats at the front for the highest status, the cheapest spots at the back, but the compressed proximity of the crowd created a temporary suspension of the rigid social hierarchies that governed the rest of Roman life. For a few hours, a senator and a freedman could shout for the same team with the same throat. Rome, for all its structure, needed somewhere to be loud. The circus was where it went. The gladiatorial games occupy a place in the Roman imagination, both ancient and modern, that is difficult to overstate. And for the wealthy, the arena was a space of particular complexity. Attending the games was expected. practically mandatory for anyone with social ambitions. But more than attending, the wealthy sponsored them. An editor, the sponsor of the games, provided the gladiators, the animals, the venue, and the elaborate program of events that filled the day. Sponsoring games was an investment in public goodwill on a scale that no other gesture could match. It was the Roman version of a political campaign, except instead of television advertisements, you provided several hours of live combat and the possibility of watching a man get eaten by a lion. The Colosseum, completed in the year 79 under the Emperor Titus, could seat roughly 50,000 people, with seating arranged with the precision of a social diagram. The emperor's box was at the front at the optimal viewing angle. Senators and vestal, virgins occupied the next tier, then equestrians, then citizens, with women and the poorest Romans at the very back, furthest from the action and closest to the smell of the animal pens below. Where you sat was who you were. The arena made social rank visible in the most literal possible way. Your distance from the sand was a measure of your importance. The gladiators themselves occupied one of Roman society's most peculiar social positions. Legally, they were in fames, those without legal standing, associated with shame and degradation, grouped with prostitutes and actors in the category of people whose profession put them outside respectable society. And yet, they were among the most recognizable and celebrated figures in the entire Roman world. Their faces appeared on oil lamps, pottery, graffiti, and children's toys. Crowds screamed their names. Women of all social classes, including those of the highest rank, apparently found them compelling in ways that Roman moralists found deeply inconvenient. The reality of gladiatorial life was considerably less glamorous than the fan devotion suggested. Gladiators lived in barracks called ludi attached to the arenas, trained under strict regimens, ate a high carbohydrate diet that modern research suggests was designed to build a subcutaneous fat layer protecting vital organs and blood vessels during combat. They were valuable assets. A skilled gladiator represented a significant financial investment by the lanista who owned and managed them, and killing gladiators recklessly was bad economics. The Hollywood image of Roman crowds universally screaming for death misrepresents the reality. Many bouts ended with the defeated gladiator surviving. The decision on his life or death made by the editor based on crowd reaction and the quality of the fight. Some wealthy Romans, including emperors, reportedly trained as gladiators themselves. Commodus famously appeared in the arena to fight, which even his contemporaries found more mortifying than impressive. Performing publicly as a gladiator was considered beneath the dignity of a free Roman citizen, let alone an emperor. But the arena drew people across social lines in ways that few other Roman institutions managed. It was the one space where everyone watched the same thing, and for a few charged hours, Rome became a single audience. For the Roman aristocrat, politics was not a career separate from life. It was life itself, the primary arena in which reputation was built, power was exercised, and a man's worth was constantly measured against his peers. The Forum Romanum, the great open space at the heart of the city surrounded by temples, government buildings and basilicas, was the stage on which Roman public life played out, and the wealthy man who wanted to matter spent a significant portion of every day there. Not occasionally, daily. The Forum was where things happened, where things were decided and where being absent was a statement people noticed. The cursus honorum, the course of honours, was the structured sequence of political offices a Roman man of good family was expected to pursue in the correct order and at the correct ages. First, military service. Then, the quaestorship, a financial administrative role that served as the entry point to the Senate. Then the aedileship, which involved managing public buildings, markets and festivals. and which required the office holder to spend his own money on public entertainments, a built-in wealth test that filtered out candidates of insufficient means, then the praetorship, a judicial role, and finally, for those with the connections, the resources and the political skill, the consulship, the highest annual magistracy, the supreme civilian honour of the Roman Republic, 2 men elected jointly to serve a single year in the most prestigious office the state provided. Each step required money. Roman elections were not corrupt in the simple sense of votes being purchased, outright, though that happened too, but the expected expenses of candidacy were enormous. Public games had to be sponsored, clients had to be maintained, gifts had to be made, dinners had to be hosted. A campaign for public office in Rome was, in financial terms, something between a modern senatorial race and buying a sports franchise. The wealthy competed for office partly from genuine political ambition, and partly because the alternative, not competing, not pursuing the cursus, was a kind of social retirement that few men of the Roman elite were willing to accept. Oratory was the essential skill that separated the politically effective from the merely well-funded. Roman oratory was treated as a high art form studied formally, practiced obsessively, and judged publicly by audiences who knew the difference between genuine eloquence and expensive noise. Cicero, whose speeches survive in extraordinary quantity, understood that the power of a well-constructed argument delivered with physical and vocal skill could shift outcomes in ways that money alone couldn't. His courtroom performances drew crowds the way the circus drew crowds. Not quite as many people and considerably more Latin, but the same basic human appetite for watching a skilled performer operate at full capacity. The forum was also where you could be destroyed. A political enemy who was better at oratory than you, who had cultivated better alliances, who struck at the right moment, that man could end a career, force an exile, produce a prosecution that stripped everything away. The forum gave and the forum took in roughly equal measure, and the wealthy Romans who navigated it successfully did so through a combination of skill, alliance, money, and the constant anxious awareness that the ground under their feet was never entirely stable. The position of wealthy Roman women requires careful attention, because it resists easy summary and rewards it considerably. Roman law treated women as perpetually in need of a male guardian, a paterfamilias in childhood, a husband in marriage, or a legal tutor in widowhood. They could not vote, hold political office, serve in the army, or participate in formal public life in the ways that defined Roman male identity. And yet, the historical record is full of wealthy Roman women who exercised extraordinary influence, managed vast estates independently, conducted their own financial affairs with considerable sophistication, patronized poets and philosophers, shaped political outcomes from apparent sidelines, and left behind evidence of lives that were far more active and consequential than the legal framework might suggest. The evolution of Roman marriage law helped. In the early Republic, marriage cum manu transferred a woman entirely into her husband's legal family and control. By the late Republic and Imperial period, marriage sine manu without this transfer of legal ownership had become standard among the elite. This meant that a married woman remained legally part of her birth family, retained rights to her own property, and was subject to her father's guardianship rather than her husband's. In practice, this gave wealthy women of the imperial era a degree of financial independence that would have surprised earlier generations. A wealthy widow with no surviving male guardian in particular could control significant property in her own name. What wealthy Roman women did with this space varied enormously. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was by any measure one of the most politically influential individuals of her era, not despite her lack of formal office, but through the consistent exercise of access, counsel, and the management of imperial relationships across decades. Her ability to shape who rose and who fell in Augustan Rome was sufficiently well known and well documented that her contemporaries discussed it openly, with a mixture of admiration and unease that tells you everything about how Romans felt about female power, real enough to acknowledge, uncomfortable enough to need explaining away. Education among wealthy Roman women was genuine and sometimes impressive. Some women were educated to a level that allowed them to participate meaningfully in the philosophical and literary conversations that structured aristocratic social life. The poet Sulpicia wrote Latin verse that survives. Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers, was celebrated for her learning and for the letters she wrote to her sons, letters considered fine enough to be collected and studied. Women attended dinner parties, contributed to conversation, and in some households were clearly expected to be intellectually present rather than merely decoratively so. The ambiguity in all of this is genuine and irreducible. Roman women of wealth had more agency than the legal framework formally allowed, and considerably less than a modern observer would consider adequate. They operated through relationships, influence, and the careful navigation of a system that rewarded compliance while sometimes making space for individual women who were too valuable, too clever, or too well connected to contain. The history of wealthy Roman women is a history of power exercised at one remove, real, consequential, and perpetually unofficial. For all their marble and wine, wealthy Romans were not immune to the specific and ancient misery of caring deeply about what other people thought of them. In fact, they may have cared more than most because Roman social life ran on reputation, dignitas, in a way that made status anxiety essentially structural. Your worth as a person was not a private matter. It was a public ledger, constantly updated, constantly readable by everyone around you. The number of clients who showed up at your morning salutatio was a number other people noted. The size of your house was compared to the house next to it. The quality of your toga was evaluated by everyone you passed in the forum, even the number of slaves who walked behind you through the streets. Your retinue communicated your rank to observers the way a motorcade communicates importance today. You were always, in every public moment, being read. The satirists had an absolute field day with this. Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, produced a body of work so precisely targeted at the anxieties of Roman aristocratic life that significant portions of it feel less like satire and more like documentary. He describes men wearing rings borrowed for the occasion of visiting a wealthy patron to suggest a wealth they don't possess. He describes hosting dinners they cannot afford in order to maintain the appearance of prosperity. He describes the elaborate performance of status in a city where everyone was performing, and everyone knew everyone else was performing, and no one could stop. It is, in the most specific technical sense, exhausting. The Romans even had a word for the anxious competitive, spending that status maintenance required. They called it ambitio, from which the modern word ambition derives, and it originally carried the specific meaning of going around soliciting votes or favour, with all the anxious calculation that implies. The English word captures only the positive face. The Latin carried the full weight of the hustle, the fear underneath, the performance required, the gap between who you were and who you needed to appear to be. Property was the most visible status battleground. Wealthy Romans spent extraordinary amounts on their homes not merely for comfort, but for the social work the homes performed. Every improvement, a new mosaic, an extended garden, a larger library, was an investment in the story the house told about its owner. Pliny the Younger describes his villas in his letters with what can only be described as loving detail, cataloguing every architectural feature and carefully managed view with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who knows his readers are both impressed and faintly jealous. He knew they were reading for exactly that reason. And then there was the particular anxiety of the newly wealthy, the freedman who had made money in trade, the soldier who had accumulated a fortune on campaign, who had resources but not the generations of family history that Roman aristocratic culture treated as the real currency. Money could buy marble, it could not buy ancestors. The satirical portrait of Trimalchio, the freed slave who hosts an absurdly lavish dinner party in Petronius's Satyricon, is funny because his wealth is real and his social position is impossible. Rome was a society that kept moving the bar just slightly above wherever you'd managed to reach. When a wealthy Roman fell ill, they had access to something considerably better than the medieval peasants' experience of leeches and Latin prayers delivered at high speed. Marginally. Roman medicine was built on Greek foundations, drawing primarily from the work of Hippocrates and his followers, and the physician Galen, who worked in Rome from the mid-2nd century, produced a body of medical theory so comprehensive and so confidently expressed that it influenced Western medicine for over 1,000 years. This sounds impressive until you discover that significant portions of it were incorrect in ways that occasionally made patients considerably worse, delivered with the kind of professional certainty that made questioning it socially difficult. Wealthy Romans could afford personal physicians, many of them Greek freedmen or enslaved men whose medical training was recognized as valuable and accordingly priced. These physicians diagnosed through observation and questioning, prescribed dietary changes, herbal treatments, rest, and exercise, all of which were often genuinely useful. They could set broken bones with reasonable competence. They could perform surgical procedures including the removal of cataracts, tonsillectomies, and amputations using instruments of recognizable design that have been found preserved in Pompeii and other sites. Roman surgical tools look disconcertingly, not entirely unlike their modern equivalents, but without germ theory, without any understanding of bacterial infection, viral disease, or the mechanism by which illness actually spread, a great deal of Roman medicine was sophisticated guesswork. Diseases were attributed to bad air, called miasma, which was not entirely wrong as an observation. Marshes and stagnant water do indeed produce illness, though not for the atmospheric reasons the Romans believed, and to imbalances in the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Restoring the balance of humours was the primary theoretical goal of most Roman medical treatment. This could mean dietary adjustment, herbal medicine, rest and fresh air, which often helped. It could also mean bloodletting, which generally did not. The wealthy had the additional dubious privilege of multiple physicians who frequently disagreed with each other in front of the patient, with the passionate disagreement of men who had very strong opinions and no shared framework for resolving them. The elder Pliny observed acidly that medicine was the only profession in which a man could kill you, and the law called it an accident. The Emperor Hadrian reportedly said that he was the only man in Rome whose physicians had not yet managed to kill him, which, given that he eventually died of a prolonged and unpleasant illness, suggests his confidence was premature. Lead, as previously mentioned, was everywhere in Roman life, in the plumbing, in the cookware, in the wine. Physicians prescribed lead-based compounds for various conditions. The water that wealthy Romans drank from their sophisticated aqueduct systems travelled through lead pipes, because lead was easy to work and the Romans had no way of knowing what it was doing to them. Chronic lead poisoning produces symptoms, including fatigue, irritability, cognitive impairment, and gout, all conditions that appear with suspicious frequency in descriptions of wealthy and imperial Romans. The Romans built the most advanced water delivery system the ancient world had ever seen, and it was quietly poisoning the people using it. History has a very specific sense of humour. Wealthy Romans had a complicated and slightly contradictory relationship with the city of Rome itself. On one hand, Rome was the centre of the world, not metaphorically but literally by Roman geographical understanding, the place where everything that mattered converged, where power resided, where culture was produced, where a man's reputation was made and unmade on a daily basis. On the other hand, Rome was also extremely loud, extremely crowded, extremely smelly in summer, in ways that defeated even the most patriotic affection, and prone to fires that periodically consumed entire neighbourhoods. The city that made you was also, in regular rotation, actively unpleasant to live in. The solution was the country villa. Wealthy Romans owned rural properties, often several of them, at varying distances from the city, to which they retreated during the summer months, for extended stays in spring and autumn, and whenever the pressures of urban life became sufficiently intolerable to justify the journey. These were not farmhouses. They were not modest retreats. They were palaces with agricultural opinions, country properties of such elaborateness that describing them as escapes from luxury is technically accurate but practically misleading. Pliny the Younger's letters describing his two primary villas, one in Tuscany, one on the Laurentian shore outside Rome, are among the most detailed accounts of Roman domestic architecture that survive. He describes his Laurentian villa with room-by-room precision, the dining rooms oriented to catch particular angles of winter light, the garden designed to provide a view from the study window that was not distracting but restorative, the private bath suite, the suite of guest rooms, the curved garden walk shaded by a vine-covered pergola. He's clearly describing a place he loves with the specific proprietary love of someone who has thought very carefully about every element of a space and considers the result successful. Reading it feels less like a letter and more like a very early iteration of architectural writing, which is probably not a coincidence. The agricultural operations that surrounded a Roman villa were real and economically significant. Large rural estates, called latifundia in their most extensive form, produced wine, olive oil, grain, and various other commodities using enslaved agricultural labour, on a scale that made the household slave operation in the city look modest. The management of a rural estate was considered both a practical necessity and a philosophical virtue. The agricultural writer Columella, the politician Cato the Elder, and Virgil in his Georgics all treated farming as a moral activity, something that connected a Roman man to the foundational values of the Republic: simplicity, self-sufficiency, honest labour. That this philosophy was expressed by men who personally performed none of the labour involved was not considered a contradiction. Philosophy and irony have always kept close company. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, advisor to the Emperor Nero, and tireless writer on the corrupting effects of luxury, owned multiple estates of considerable grandeur, employed hundreds of slaves, and wrote about the importance of simple living from a property that included ornamental fish ponds. He was aware of the irony, addressed it in his letters with characteristic elegance, and continued to own the fish ponds. The country villa was where wealthy Romans went to be the version of themselves they preferred. Whether that version was real was perhaps beside the point. A wealthy Roman child entered the world with considerable fanfare and immediately became the subject of an extraordinary amount of organised attention. But before any of that fanfare could begin, the child had to survive its first few minutes, because the first decision about a Roman infant's life was not made by the child or by fate or by the gods. It was made by the pater familias, the male head of the household, who exercised the ancient right of deciding whether the newborn would be formally acknowledged into the family. The ritual was called tollere liberos, to lift up the child. If the paterfamilias crossed the room, bent down, and physically lifted the infant from the floor where it had been placed, the child was accepted. If he turned away, the child could be exposed, left outside on a rubbish heap or a roadside, to die of the elements, or to be taken by whoever came by, which might mean slavery. This was legal, this was practiced, and this happened within the first hours of a life that had not yet had the opportunity to be anything at all. For the children acknowledged into wealthy families, however, the experience shifted rapidly from existential uncertainty to organised comfort. Nurses were assigned immediately, the nutrix, a woman whose role was to feed, hold, and tend the infant through the early years. Wealthy Romans debated the question of whether a mother should nurse her own children or delegate this to a hired or enslaved wet nurse, and the debate had the characteristic Roman quality of being simultaneously philosophical and deeply status-conscious. Delegating nursing to a nutrix was common among the elite, partly for practical reasons and partly because maternal nursing was associated in some minds with the lower classes who had no one else to do it. As the child grew, education began early and was taken seriously. The pedagogus, typically an educated Greek slave, was assigned to accompany the child everywhere, supervising behaviour, beginning language instruction, and providing a constant adult presence between the nurse and the formal tutor. Think of it as a combination of nanny, bodyguard, and language immersion program delivered by a person who had no choice in the matter and was probably overqualified for it. The formal grammaticus took over around the age of 7, teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and the memorization of significant quantities of Latin and Greek poetry. By the time a wealthy Roman boy was 12, he was expected to have Homer and Virgil by heart. Boys attended the forum with their fathers from an early age, observing the salutatio, watching legal proceedings, absorbing the rhythms of public life that they would eventually be expected to navigate themselves. This was not optional enrichment. It was preparation. Roman aristocratic boyhood was relentlessly purposeful, a series of staged exposures to the adult world, each one advancing the child's preparation for the role they would assume. There was no concept of childhood as a protected space of pure play. There were toys, hoops, balls, wooden swords, small figures, and there were games, and there was genuine affection within Roman families that the historical record preserves in touching detail. But these existed alongside the expectations, not instead of them. Girls of wealthy families received real education, more than their lower-class counterparts, and more than the formal legal framework suggested they needed. A girl who could read, discuss literature, and manage a household account was a better marriage prospect, and a more useful partner in the aristocratic project of social maintenance. Some received instruction alongside their brothers until the point where their paths formally diverged. Then came marriage preparation, household management, and the beginning of the adult life that had been, in all essential respects, arranged before they were old enough to have opinions about it. Roman childhood for the wealthy was a well-funded rehearsal for a play someone else had already written. Marriage among the Roman wealthy was, first and most importantly, a transaction. Not a transaction in the pejorative modern sense, something cold and mercenary dressed up in false sentiment, but a transaction in the precise, legal, fully acknowledged sense that everyone involved understood and accepted as the foundation of the arrangement. Marriage was an alliance between families. It was a mechanism for transferring wealth across generations. It was a means of cementing political connections, settling disputes, and signalling alliances to a watching social world. That two people might also find each other tolerable, or even, under fortunate circumstances, genuinely attached, was a pleasant possibility that Roman aristocratic culture acknowledged without requiring. The process began with negotiation. The paterfamilias on each side, or their representatives, discussed terms, the dowry the bride's family would provide, the property arrangements, the social suitability of the match. A Roman bride's dowry was hers in a meaningful sense. It was provided by her family and returned to her or her family in the event the marriage ended. This gave the bride's family a financial stake in how the marriage was conducted, and gave the woman herself a degree of economic protection that distinguished Roman marriage from simpler arrangements in which a woman arrived empty-handed and left the same way. Wealthy Roman men typically married in their late 20s, after they had begun the cursus honorum and established at least the foundations of a career. Women married considerably younger, late teens to early 20s, was standard among the elite, though the legal minimum age was 12 for girls, and marriages at that age did occur, particularly when political circumstances created urgency. The age gap between husband and wife was often significant, producing household dynamics that the Romans themselves sometimes commented on with a candour that suggests they found the situations at least occasionally awkward. Divorce was available to both parties and required, by later Republican and imperial standards, remarkably little ceremony. A Roman could simply state, in front of witnesses, that the marriage was over and it was over. Among the elite, divorce was common enough to be unremarkable. Julius Caesar divorced his wife Pompeia after the Bonadea scandal, not because he believed she'd done anything wrong, but because, as he famously explained, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. The point was the appearance, not the substance. Appearance was always the point. Remarriage after divorce or widowhood carried no social stigma for men who routinely married multiple times across a career for political and financial reasons. For women, remarriage was possible, but more socially complicated, scrutinized more closely by the moral commentary that Roman culture applied to female behaviour at volumes it never quite matched for men. A widow who remarried too quickly was potentially suspicious. A widow who remained unmarried indefinitely was potentially threatening. A woman with property and no husband was, in Roman terms, a structural anomaly. The ideal was a respectable interval followed by a suitable second match, approved by appropriate male authority. What the Romans built into marriage above all else was flexibility at the top of the social structure and fixed expectation throughout. The wealthy could divorce and remarry as circumstances evolved. The legal framework accommodated the reality that political alliances shifted, that financial situations changed, that the man you married at 20 was not necessarily the strategic partner you needed at 40. Roman marriage was a living document, subject to amendment. What it was not, for the vast majority of participants, was purely a matter of the heart. That came later, as a bonus, if you were lucky. The contract came first. Death in ancient Rome for the wealthy was not a quiet private affair. It was a production, perhaps the final production, the culminating performance in a life that had been, from the morning salutatio to the last dinner party, conducted largely in public. And like all Roman productions, it was subject to social evaluation, shaped by the expectations of observers, and capable of either cementing or destroying a reputation in its final act. The Romans thought carefully about death. They wrote about it extensively. Stoic philosophy in particular returned to mortality with almost compulsive regularity, the need to accept it, to prepare for it, to not allow the fear of it to corrupt the living of life. Seneca's letters discuss death the way modern newsletters discuss productivity. At length, with practical advice, and with the underlying anxiety of someone who hasn't entirely resolved the question. Roman wills were documents of extraordinary social weight. They were not merely practical instruments for distributing property, though they were that. They were public statements, read aloud after death to audiences who analysed every bequest for what it revealed about the deceased's loyalties, affections, grudges, and final judgments on the people in their life. A wealthy Roman who left a significant bequest to a former enemy sent a message. A wealthy Roman who left nothing to a lifelong associate sent a different but equally loud one. The will was the last speech, and in Rome, speeches were always political. The practice of legacy hunting, captatio the Romans called it, was widespread enough to have its own vocabulary and its own substantial literature of satirical commentary. The captatores were those who devoted themselves to cultivating the favour of wealthy, childless elderly Romans in hopes of appearing prominently in the will. They visited daily, brought gifts, expressed devoted concern for health and comfort, praised every opinion, and endured every eccentricity with the patient attentiveness of people whose attention was entirely motivated by what it might eventually return. The wealthy targets of this attention were often entirely aware of what was happening. Some played along with theatrical enjoyment, altering the will periodically to punish a captatores who had committed some minor offence and reward one who had recently distinguished themselves. It was, in its way, one of the more honest relationships in Roman aristocratic life. Everyone knew the terms. The funeral itself was a civic performance of the first order. The body was carried through the streets in a procession that included musicians, professional mourners called praeficii, whose job was to weep and wail with convincing theatrical grief, and actors wearing wax masks, imagines, of the family's distinguished ancestors. This last detail deserves a pause. At a wealthy Roman's funeral, people dressed as his dead relatives walked in the procession. His grandfather was there. His great-great-uncle who had been consul was there. The family's entire distinguished history was physically present, marching through the streets of Rome in wax and costume, making the point, one final spectacular time, that this man had not arrived from nowhere. He came from somewhere. He came from them. A funeral oration was delivered in the forum, a speech assessing the life and achievements of the deceased for the benefit of the assembled public, and then the burning cremation was standard through much of the imperial period, and the collection of ashes in an urn placed in the family tomb. The tomb itself was a status object, built along the roads leading out of Roman cities, designed to be seen by everyone passing in and out. Even in death you were on the street competing for attention. Rome never really let you stop performing. No account of Roman wealth would be complete without confronting the extreme end of the spectrum, the emperor. Because if the aristocrats were rich, the emperor was something beyond rich, something that required a different category entirely. Not wealth as a quantity, but wealth as a condition, like gravity or weather, a structural feature of the world rather than a personal attribute. The emperor controlled the treasury of the world's largest empire. He owned provinces. He received tribute from client kingdoms. His personal estates, the patrimonium, were spread across the Mediterranean world, encompassing farms, mines, quarries, forests, fisheries, and entire cities. The distinction between the emperor's private wealth and the state's public resources was, in practice, essentially whatever the emperor decided it was on any given day. The behaviour of individual emperors with this absolute power ranged from the genuinely impressive to the genuinely alarming, with occasional stops at the completely inexplicable. Augustus, the first emperor, was by most measures a political genius who understood that the appearance of republican restraint was more durable than open autocracy, and governed accordingly for 40 years. Hadrian travelled his entire empire personally, inspecting provinces, commissioning buildings, and managing the vast bureaucratic machine with the attentiveness of a man who actually wanted to know what was happening. Marcus Aurelius wrote philosophical meditations on humility and the duty of service while commanding the most powerful military force in the world. These were not simple men. Then there were the others. Caligula, who ruled for 4 years before being assassinated, reportedly appointed his horse Incitatus to the priesthood, and according to sources that may have been exaggerating for effect, proposed making him consul. Historians debate whether this was literal, a joke, or a pointed political insult to the Senate suggesting the horse could do the job as well as they could. All three interpretations are plausible, and all three say something interesting about Caligula's relationship with the institutions he nominally led. Nero performed publicly as an actor, singer and charioteer, which his contemporaries found so undignified that several of them attempted to assassinate him. He had his mother Agrippina killed. He kicked his pregnant wife to death. He blamed the Christians for a fire that may or may not have been his fault. His reign also produced some of Rome's finest architectural ambitions and some of its best poetry, because history refuses to be simple. Domitian spent hours alone stabbing flies with a stylus, according to Suetonius. Whether this is historical fact or the kind of detail a hostile biographer invents to make a disliked emperor seem unhinged is difficult to verify. What is clear is that Domitian also administered the empire with considerable competence and was hated by the Senate for it, because he didn't pretend to consult them. The senatorial class wrote the history, which is why the emperors they disliked for being too openly autocratic received worse press than the emperors who were openly monstrous, but maintained the social fiction of consultation. Absolute power in Rome produced both the Pantheon and Caligula's horse. Both the Colosseum and Nero's Golden House, a palace so enormous that Vespasian demolished parts of it specifically to give the land back to the people and fill the ornamental lake with the Colosseum instead. What the emperors built and what they destroyed, how they used the unimaginable resources of the empire and what they became under the pressure of unchecked authority, all of it tells the same story. Power on this scale has no precedent and no guardrails. Rome found this out repeatedly, learned nothing durable and kept going anyway. After everything, the toga requiring 2 attendants, the garum on absolutely everything, the clients at dawn, the stuffed dormice, the 6-hour dinners eaten horizontally, the philosophers deployed between acrobats, the country villa owned by the man, writing about the virtues of simplicity, the lead pipes quietly doing their work. What did enormous wealth in ancient Rome actually purchase? It's worth asking the question honestly, because the Romans asked it themselves, with more seriousness and more eloquence than most cultures manage about their own excesses. In material terms, the answer was genuine. A wealthy Roman's life was comfortable by the standards of the ancient world in ways that were not trivial. The hypocaust floors were warm. The food was genuinely varied and frequently excellent. The baths were real marvels of engineering that provided pleasures, warmth, cleanliness, massage, social contact that most of the world would not have access to for centuries. The houses were beautiful, the libraries were real, the access to art, music, philosophy and the most interesting minds of the age was genuine and substantial. If you were going to be alive in the 1st or 2nd century, being wealthy in Rome was among the better options available. But wealth in Rome did not buy safety, and this is the detail that the marble tends to obscure. The political violence of Roman aristocratic life was constant, unpredictable, and entirely capable of reaching into the most fortified house. Emperors executed senators, senators conspired against emperors, political enemies brought prosecutions, friends became enemies when the wind changed. The elder Pliny died watching Vesuvius from too close a distance because his curiosity was greater than his caution. Cicero, the greatest orator Rome produced, was murdered on the road while fleeing political enemies, his hands and head displayed in the forum where he had spoken. The forum gave and the forum took, and it took with no particular regard for how much marble you owned. Wealth did not buy immunity from disease. It bought better physicians, which helped sometimes and occasionally made things worse. The same aqueducts that brought clean water through lead pipes to wealthy households also distributed whatever the lead was doing to everyone's cognition equally across the social spectrum, which is perhaps the most democratic feature of Roman infrastructure. Wealth did not buy peace of mind. The Stoic philosophers, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, though Epictetus was enslaved and therefore a different category entirely, returned to this point obsessively. The anxiety of the wealthy Roman was structural and inescapable, because the same system that elevated you could dismantle you, and everyone knew it, and no amount of mosaic floor made the knowledge go away. What Rome's wealthy did buy, and what they bought with an intensity that still reaches across 2,000 years, was permanence, or the attempt at it. The buildings, the poetry, the sculpture, the law, the philosophy, the engineering, all of it was, at some level, a civilizational argument against disappearance. The Romans were acutely, almost painfully aware of mortality, and they responded by building things designed to outlast it. The Pantheon is still standing. The aqueducts still cross the landscape of southern France. Cicero's letters still exist. Virgil's poetry is still read. The attempt at permanence did not succeed in the way its authors hoped. Rome fell, as things do, but something stranger and more interesting happened instead. The attempt itself became permanent. What the wealthy Romans built and wrote and commissioned and argued about is still here, still read, still argued about, still shaping the way the Western world thinks about law and government and architecture, and what a public bath should ideally feel like. They were anxious, performative, sometimes monstrous, occasionally magnificent, surrounded by suffering they mostly chose not to examine too closely, and they built things that lasted. Not so different from certain other wealthy civilizations, if you look at it in the right light, from the right distance, through 2,000 years of very selective memory. The toga was impractical, the garum was pungent, the dormice were a choice, but the Pantheon still stands, the rain still falls through its oculus, and the building still makes people stop in the middle of whatever they were doing and simply look up. That is what wealth, in the end, bought them. Not safety, not peace, not enough time, but the possibility, occasionally realized, of making something worth stopping for. Let's talk about Roman pets, because the wealthy Romans' relationship with animals was one of the more revealing windows into a civilization that consistently blurred the line between affection and performance. Romans kept pets, genuinely, tenderly, sometimes embarrassingly kept them. Dogs were common and beloved. Epitaphs for dogs survive on actual tombstones, composed with the same careful grief as epitaphs for people, mourning specific animals by name with lines describing their loyalty, their appearance, their habits. The poet Martial wrote, an epitaph for a small dog named Isa, belonging to a friend that describes her as more pure than a dove's kiss, gentler than a maiden, more precious than Indian gems. This was not unusual. This was standard Roman dog owner behaviour, recognizable across 2,000 years with minimal translation required. But for the wealthy, ordinary dogs were not enough. The wealthy Romans' menagerie was a status operation, and it escalated with the same competitive logic as everything else. Exotic birds were popular and expensive. Peacocks wandered the gardens of the rich, their extravagant tails dragging across the same mosaic floors that slaves spent hours polishing. Nightingales were kept in cages and trained to sing, then eaten at dinner if they performed inadequately or if the host needed to impress guests with the casual destruction of something beautiful and expensive. This was considered sophisticated. Monkeys were imported from Africa and kept as pets, dressed in miniature clothing, trained to perform tricks at dinner parties where they apparently functioned as a combination of entertainment and conversation piece. If the philosopher at your dinner table ran dry, there was always the monkey. Fish ponds, piscinae, deserve special attention, because wealthy Romans developed an attachment to their fish that crossed from enthusiasm into something the Romans themselves found amusing and slightly concerning. The orator and statesman Cicero coined the term piscinari, fish fanciers, as a mildly contemptuous label for wealthy men who devoted excessive attention to their ornamental fish ponds while neglecting civic duty. The fish ponds in question were elaborate saltwater pools built into the grounds of coastal villas, stocked with expensive fish. Marina, the moray eel, was a particular favourite that their owners named hand-fed and apparently mourned genuinely when they died. The orator Hortensius, one of the great legal minds of the late Republic, reportedly wept at the death of a particularly beloved moray eel. Cicero found this ridiculous. Cicero also had extremely strong opinions about everything, so the weight we assign his judgment is a matter of personal preference. Lions, leopards and bears were kept by the very wealthiest, not as pets in any domestic sense, but as displays of power and access, housed in private menageries on villa grounds, and occasionally deployed at private entertainments in ways that required substantial infrastructure and a staff willing to risk significant personal injury. The Emperor Augustus reportedly kept a tame tiger. Hadrian kept lions. The line between a private exotic animal collection and the resources of the imperial treasury was, for emperors, essentially invisible. What all of this animal keeping shared was the fundamental Roman equation of living things with status. The more unusual, the more expensive, the more demanding to maintain, the better the signal. A dog said you were a normal person who liked dogs. A named moray eel you hand-fed in a saltwater pond said something considerably more specific about your wealth, your leisure, and your willingness to invest emotional energy in a large aggressive fish. Rome contained multitudes, but its wealthy contained them loudest. In a city of 1 million people with open sewers, public latrines, and no reliable waste management system beyond the rain and the goodwill of slaves with buckets, the question of personal scent was not merely cosmetic, it was survival strategy, and for the wealthy Roman, it was also, inevitably, a competition. Roman perfumery was a serious industry drawing on trade networks that stretched to Arabia, India and sub-Saharan Africa for raw materials. Frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, spikenard, rose oil, iris, and dozens of other botanical ingredients processed into perfumes, ointments, and scented oils that were applied to the body, the hair, the clothing, the furniture, and occasionally the walls, if it could be scented. Rome scented it. The perfume trade was genuinely global and genuinely expensive. The most prized ingredients, nard from the Himalayan foothills, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, frankincense from southern Arabia, travelled thousands of miles along the same trade routes that brought silk and spices to Roman tables, and arrived at prices that reflected every mile of that journey. Pliny the Elder, who had opinions about everything and wrote most of them down in his natural history, complained bitterly about the drain of Roman silver eastward to pay for luxury goods including perfumes, estimating the annual cost to the Roman economy with the wounded outrage of a man personally offended by other people's spending choices. His calculations were probably not entirely accurate. His outrage was entirely genuine. Wealthy Roman women used cosmetics with a sophistication that would be recognizable today, if you adjusted for the ingredient list. Foundation made from white lead was applied to achieve the pale complexion associated with leisure and indoor life, the implication being that you were wealthy enough not to work outdoors in the sun. Red ochre provided blush for lips and cheeks. Coal and antimony darkened the eyes. Eyebrows were darkened and shaped. Hair was dyed. Blonde hair was fashionable in certain periods, associated with the Germanic and Gallic women Romans encountered through conquest, and Roman women achieved it through mixtures of nutshells, vinegar, and other preparations that likely also achieved mild chemical burns if applied with insufficient caution. The cosmetics used by Roman women were, by modern standards, alarming in their toxicity. White lead foundation applied daily represented significant chronic lead exposure, contributing to the general Roman lead poisoning situation from yet another angle. Antimony coal was a heavy metal compound. Several of the dyes used in hair preparation contained substances that modern chemistry would label with warning symbols. Roman women who used these products regularly were, in a very literal sense, paying for their beauty with their health, and had no way of knowing it. Men were not exempt. Wealthy Roman men used scented oil daily, applied after bathing, worked into the hair, sometimes applied to the beard. Scented wreaths were worn at dinner parties. Perfumed slaves walked beside wealthy men in public, wafting fragrance in their vicinity. The smell of a wealthy Roman arriving somewhere was, by all accounts, detectable before the visual. In a city that smelled of everything else Rome smelled of, arriving in a cloud of expensive Arabian frankincense was a statement that required no words. It was money made airborne, status distributed in every direction, lingering long after the person had moved on. The Romans, whatever else can be said about them, understood the power of a first impression that arrived ahead of you. The Roman road network was one of the genuine engineering miracles of the ancient world. 50,000 miles of paved road connecting the empire from Scotland to Mesopotamia, built straight, built solid, built to last, and still providing the foundational routes for European roads 2,000 years later. The Romans built roads with the same systematic confidence they brought to aqueducts, law, and military organization. Here is a problem, here is an engineering solution, executed across an entire continent. The result was a transportation infrastructure that allowed armies, messages, and goods to move at speeds the ancient world had never previously achieved. For the wealthy Roman who wished to use this infrastructure personally, the experience was substantially less triumphant than the engineering implied. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, expensive, and subject to weather, bandits, broken axles, and the general mechanical fragility of wooden vehicles on stone roads. The litter, the lectica, was the preferred transport of wealthy Romans within cities, an enclosed or semi-enclosed seat or couch carried on the shoulders of 4 to 8 enslaved men, allowing the occupant to travel through Rome's crowded streets without walking, without dust, and without personal contact with the press of the city. A large, elaborately decorated litter with a full complement of well-dressed carriers was a mobile status statement that announced your arrival to everyone on the street before you stepped out of it. For longer journeys, wealthy Romans used carriages, the reader for long-distance travel with luggage, the more comfortable carpentum for shorter trips, various lighter vehicles for faster travel alone. None of them had suspension in any meaningful sense. Roman roads were smooth by ancient standards and absolutely punishing by any standard that involved sitting in a wooden box for 10 hours. Wealthy travellers lined their carriages with cushions, brought food and wine, stopped at mansions, official way stations along imperial roads, that provided fresh horses, food, and accommodation ranging from adequate to genuinely unpleasant depending on location. The historian Horace described a journey from Rome to Brindisi with the weary specificity of a man recounting a commute that had gone wrong in every possible way over multiple days. Sea travel was faster for long distances but concentrated all available discomforts into a smaller space with the addition of nausea. Roman cargo ships were not designed for passenger comfort. Wealthy travellers hired space on vessels, brought their own provisions, slaves, bedding and entertainment, and then endured whatever the Mediterranean decided to provide in terms of weather, which in the ancient world was genuinely unpredictable and genuinely dangerous. Shipwreck was common enough to appear regularly in Roman literature as a standard misfortune rather than a dramatic exception. The Apostle Paul shipwrecked 3 times. Julius Caesar was captured by pirates. Cicero crossed 2. Gruesome conditions he described with the resigned discomfort of someone who'd been told this would take a week, and was now on day 12. What wealthy Romans bought with their money was not comfortable travel. It was slightly less uncomfortable travel with better food and more people carrying your things, The empire was connected. Getting across it remained an act of endurance. Roman religion among the wealthy was a complicated, layered, and sometimes deeply contradictory thing. Not the simple pantheon of named gods performing human dramas that popular culture tends to present, but a system of obligations, rituals, civic duties, private devotions, imported cults, philosophical skepticism, and genuine superstitious anxiety that operated simultaneously and not always harmoniously. The Roman elite were quite capable of quoting Epicurean philosophy about the gods' indifference to human affairs at dinner, and then stopping on the way home to make a small offering at a roadside shrine, because the journey had involved a bad omen and you couldn't be too careful. Intellectual skepticism and practical superstition coexisted in the Roman mind with a peacefulness that would alarm a logician. The official state religion was, first and foremost, a civic obligation. The great temples to Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, Venus, and the rest were public institutions. Their priests were magistrates. The sacrifices performed at state festivals were political acts as much as religious ones, affirming the relationship between Rome and its gods, which was understood as a contractual arrangement. The Romans performed the correct rituals correctly. The gods provided victory, prosperity, and protection in return. The term for this was pax diorum, the peace of the gods, and maintaining it was a state responsibility. When things went wrong, military defeats, plagues, famines, prodigies, the question was always what ritual had been performed incorrectly, what obligation had been neglected, what the gods were owed that Rome had failed to provide. For wealthy individuals, private religion added another layer. Every Roman home had a lararium, a small household shrine, often a niche in the wall of the atrium or kitchen, housing small figurines of the lares, the household gods who protected the family and the home. Daily offerings were made here: incense, wine, small cakes, flowers. The birthday of the paterfamilias involved special ceremonies at the lararium. Significant household events, a birth, a marriage, a departure for a long journey, received offerings and prayers. The relationship with the household gods was intimate, daily, and personal in a way that the great state temples were not. Augury, the reading of omens, particularly the behaviour of birds, was taken with a seriousness that modern sensibility finds difficult to fully credit. A consul, about to leave for a military campaign, who observed birds feeding on the wrong side or not feeding at all, could delay the departure. Lightning on the left was auspicious, on the right concerning. The entrails of sacrificed animals were examined by specialist priests called haruspices, who read the liver's condition as an index of divine favour. These were not fringe practices performed by credulous peasants. They were conducted by the most sophisticated and educated men in the world's most powerful civilization. The Romans were not stupid. They simply lived with a different relationship to uncertainty, one in which the universe's intentions were legible if you knew where to look and what you owed in return for the looking. Exotic foreign cults added further texture. The cult of Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia, all found wealthy Roman adherents drawn by the promise of personal salvation, mystical experience, or simply the appeal of the foreign and the esoteric. Rome absorbed the religious practices of its conquered territories with a tolerance that was partly philosophical and partly practical. An empire containing every known religion is easier to manage if you don't insist on replacing all of them. The gods of Rome were many. There was room for more. The wealthy Roman navigated all of them, keeping all available options open, because when it came to divine insurance, more coverage was always preferable to less. Let's end where the city itself ended every day, after dark, when the torches came out and Rome became a different place entirely. Because the Rome you've been hearing about, the marble and the mosaics, the dinner parties and the forum speeches, the philosophers and the dormice and the carefully arranged toga, that Rome existed in daylight. After sunset, the city transformed, and the transformation was not gentle. Rome at night was loud, dangerous, and alive in ways that had nothing to do with senatorial dignity. The streets of Rome were, during daylight hours, full of pedestrians but largely closed to wheeled traffic, Julius. Caesar had banned carts and wagons from the city centre during daylight to reduce the gridlock that apparently made Roman streets impassable. So the carts came at night. From sunset until dawn, the wheeled traffic that supplied the city's 1 million people with grain, building materials, wine, and everything else a 1 million-person city required, moved through the streets in a grinding, clattering, wheel-on-stone roar that made sleep in ground-floor apartments essentially impossible. The poet Juvenal complained about it with magnificent fury. The noise of the city at night, the wagons in the narrow streets, the shouting of the drivers, the impossibility of rest. He described insomnia as an unavoidable tax on living in Rome, regardless of wealth. Wealthy Romans slept better than their poorer neighbours for the simple reason that their houses were set back from the street, insulated by thick walls, inner gardens, and the physical buffer of property and distance. But even the grandest domus was not entirely proof against the city. Rome never fully slept. Street food vendors set up throughout the night. Roman apartments had no kitchens and their residents ate out all day and into the night from the thermopolia that lined Roman streets. Taverns stayed open. The sound of argument, laughter, music, and the occasional violent altercation filtered through the dark hours with casual consistency. The wealthy who ventured out after dark did so with significant personal infrastructure. Torches were carried by slaves. A wealthy man walking the streets at night moved in a small bubble of light, surrounded by attendants who served simultaneously as illumination and security. Rome after dark had no street lighting in any organised sense. Outside the pool of your torchlight, the city was genuinely dark in ways that modern urban dwellers have almost no reference point for. Alleys were black. The distance between torches felt considerable. Muggers, Juvenal tells us, were a real feature of the nighttime city, and the advice he offered, don't go out at night without having written your will first, was only partially hyperbolic. For the very wealthy, the night ended not in darkness, but in the quiet of the inner house, the garden breathing in the dark, the household shrine's small lamp flickering in the lararium niche. Somewhere in the kitchen, preparations for tomorrow were already beginning. Somewhere in the outer rooms, slaves who never fully slept kept the house in the state of readiness it required. And somewhere in Rome, a cart was grinding over stone, a vendor was calling from a street corner, a drunk was making a philosophical point to no one in particular, and the city was doing what it always did, continuing regardless in all directions at once. Tomorrow the clients would return at dawn. The toga would require 2 people and several minutes. The garum would reappear on the table. The forum would fill with men performing their importance for one another with various degrees of success. The philosopher would be deployed between courses. The fish pond would need attention. The lead pipes would continue their quiet work. And somewhere in the distance, the Pantheon would stand in the rain, its oculus open to whatever the sky decided to send through, patient and indifferent and permanent in a way that everything around it simply was not. Rome would go on, for now. Let's talk about something the travel brochures for ancient Rome consistently leave out: where exactly a wealthy Roman went when nature called, and what happened after. Because Rome built the most sophisticated water delivery system the ancient world had ever seen, 11 major aqueducts supplying the city with an estimated 1 million cubic meters of fresh water daily, and then used a significant portion of that engineering triumph to flush sewage through underground channels into the Tiber. This was, by ancient standards, genuinely advanced. By any other standard, it is a story about a civilization that solved the wrong half of the problem first and never quite caught up. The public latrines, the foracae, were one of Rome's more democratic institutions. They were communal, open, and entirely without the concept of privacy. Stone benches with holes cut at regular intervals lined the walls of the latrine chamber. You sat beside whoever else happened to be there. You talked, if conversation arose, because Romans apparently found nothing unusual about conducting social business while attending to biological business. The channel of running water beneath the seats carried waste away continuously. A shared sponge on a stick, the xylospongium, served the function that modern plumbing made unnecessary to consider. It was rinsed in the channel of water running in front of the seats and returned to general availability, shared, between everyone. This is historically accurate and nobody's favourite detail. Wealthy Romans had private latrines within their homes, which was better in terms of privacy and worse in terms of certain engineering realities. Roman household waste disposal connected in the best cases to the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, originally an open drainage channel that had been covered and extended over centuries into an underground network. The Cloaca Maxima was genuinely impressive as infrastructure. It was large enough, according to Pliny, for a hay cart to pass through. It emptied into the Tiber. The Tiber, which also supplied some of the city's water, received everything Rome produced and carried it, with varying efficiency depending on the season, toward the sea. The gap between wealthy and poor in Roman sanitation was real, but not as wide as you might hope. The wealthy had private facilities. They had running water in their homes. They had slaves whose responsibilities included the management of chamber pots and the maintenance of latrine areas with the same dutiful attention given to every other domestic function. But the city surrounding even the grandest domus was the same city everyone else lived in, and the same streets ran past every door. The waste that upper-floor apartment dwellers in Rome's crowded insulae emptied from windows with minimal warning landed on the same streets that senators walked home from the forum along. Roman law made this technically illegal. Roman practice made it entirely normal. The smell of Rome was, by all accounts, significant. The satirists mention it. The writers mention it. The perfume industry existed partly in direct response to it. Wealthy Romans leaving their houses entered the city's general atmosphere the moment the door opened, and no amount of frankincense or rosewater entirely solved the problem of sharing a city of 1 million with the sanitation infrastructure of a very ambitious village. What Rome achieved in waste management was genuinely ahead of its time, and genuinely insufficient simultaneously. The aqueducts were a miracle. The Cloaca Maxima was a marvel, and the shared sponge was there the whole time, waiting patiently to remind you that every civilization, no matter how magnificent, has at least one detail that doesn't survive the telling entirely intact. A wealthy Roman child did not stumble accidentally into literacy. Education among the Roman elite was systematic, demanding, and organized with the same purposeful efficiency that Romans brought to road building and siege warfare, because in Roman society an educated man was an armed man, and the weapon he carried was language. The ability to speak well, argue precisely, quote appropriately, and write persuasively was not a social grace. It was the foundational skill of Roman public life, and the education that produced it began early, ran long, and left very little time for activities that did not contribute to the eventual production of a competent Roman citizen ready to perform in the forum. The first stage was the literator, the primary teacher, often an educated slave or freedman, operating a small school called a ludus from a rented room, a portico, or occasionally the open street, which meant that children studied against the backdrop of Rome's permanent ambient noise. Wax tablets and a stylus were the tools. reusable, practical, and leaving no permanent record of early mistakes, which was merciful. Reading, writing, and basic arithmetic occupied these years. The discipline was, by modern standards, physical. The wooden rod was a standard teaching tool, and Roman education did not share contemporary squeamishness about the connection between physical discomfort and academic motivation. The second stage brought the grammaticus, the literary teacher who introduced the great texts. Virgil's Aeneid was the central text of Roman education, memorized, analyzed, recited, discussed, the way a culture uses its foundational epic as a mirror and a map simultaneously. Homer in Greek followed, because a Roman education that did not include Greek was considered incomplete, roughly the way a modern education without mathematics might be considered adequate for some purposes, but not for serious ones. The Grammaticus drilled his students in grammar, meter, and literary analysis with a thoroughness that would alarm most modern curriculum designers. The third and most important stage was the rhetor, the teacher of rhetoric. This was the culmination of Roman education, the training that everything else had been preparing for, because rhetoric was not simply the art of speaking. It was the art of thinking in public, of organising argument, of anticipating objection, of deploying evidence with timing and precision, of reading an audience and adjusting to what they needed to hear. Cicero's Institutes of Oratory, or rather quintillions, the great first-century teacher who systematised Roman rhetorical education, laid out the entire programme with the comprehensive specificity of someone who understood that producing great orators was the primary purpose of Roman education, and all other learning was in service of it. Wealthy Romans sometimes sent their sons to Greece for finishing, to Athens or Rhodes, to study with Greek philosophers and rhetoricians at the source. This was the Roman equivalent of a postgraduate degree abroad, prestigious enough to be worth the expense and the separation, expected among the most ambitious families. A young man who returned from Athens with polished Greek, a grounding in philosophy, and the social contacts accumulated during study abroad, was better equipped for the forum than one who had studied only in Rome. The investment was understood on both sides. Education in Rome was not a preparation for life. It was the architecture of power, and the wealthy built it carefully, floor by floor, from the wax tablet to the forum, never losing sight of what the whole structure was eventually for. If you wanted to know what was happening in Rome, who had fallen from favour, who was sleeping with whom, whose fortune had evaporated, whose dinner party had ended in a scandal that was still being discussed 3 weeks later, you did not need a newspaper. You needed a barber, a bathhouse, and the forum, roughly in that order. Rome had no formal mass media, but it had something functionally equivalent, an information ecosystem so dense, so fast, and so creative in its methods of transmission that modern observers have called it the world's first social media network, which is either a compliment to Rome or an indictment of social media, depending on your perspective. Written notices called acta diurna, daily acts, were posted in public spaces from the time of Julius Caesar onward, recording official government business, legal proceedings, births, deaths, military announcements, and public events. These were inscribed on whitened boards displayed in prominent locations and copied by scribes who distributed versions throughout the city and eventually across the empire. A wealthy Roman in his country villa could receive news of the events in the city through these copied acta and through the personal letters that travelled along the imperial road network carried by slaves and couriers. Cicero's letters preserve an extraordinary picture of this information ecosystem in action. He writes to his friend Atticus almost daily when separated, exchanging news, analysis, and commentary on events with the casual regularity of text messages and the literary quality of essays. But the unofficial information network was faster and more interesting than any official posting. Barbers were the acknowledged centres of Roman gossip. Their shops were gathering points where men sat for extended periods in proximity and conversation, and the information that passed through a busy Roman barbershop on any given day covered the full range of political, social, and personal intelligence available in the city. The satirist Horace complained about the barbershop as a source of unreliable information, with the exasperation of a man who'd been ambushed by it too many times to remain philosophical. Satire was the formal literary expression of this gossip culture, and the Romans produced satirists of extraordinary venom and precision. Juvenal dissected the pretensions of the wealthy with surgical contempt. Martial composed epigrams, short, sharp, two-line ambushes that skewered specific recognizable types with a wit so clean it still draws blood on rereading. Petronius's Satyricon presented the entire social world of the nouveau riche Roman in a fictional frame so recognizable to his contemporaries that it read as documentary. These writers were not marginal figures. They were widely read, widely circulated, and widely feared by the people they wrote about. The wealthy were both the primary consumers and the primary subjects of Roman satire, which created a specific and uncomfortable dynamic. You read Martial's latest collection at your dinner party and laughed at the portraits of vain, status-anxious, socially climbing wealthy Romans, and then spent the rest of the evening wondering quietly whether any of them were you. In Rome, as in most highly connected social environments, the line between the person laughing at the satire and the person who had inspired it was thinner than anyone liked to acknowledge. The information moved fast, the commentary was sharp, and nobody, regardless of how much marble they owned, was entirely safe from the epigram that arrived, like most dangerous things, small and without warning. Rome had a relationship with death that was simultaneously pragmatic, theatrical, and surprisingly festive, and nowhere was this more visible than in the funerary traditions of the wealthy, particularly the practice of holding banquets at, near, and for the benefit of the dead, in ways that blurred the boundary between mourning and celebration until it became, in the most literal sense, a matter of interpretation. The Romans did not treat death as a full stop. They treated it as a transition requiring management, and management in Rome required food, wine, the presence of people who mattered, and a suitable venue. The dead were fed. The dead were toasted. The dead were periodically invited to parties. The refrigerium was a funerary meal held at the tomb, typically on the day of burial, and then on specific commemorative occasions, the Parentalia in February, the Lemuria in May, the birthday of the deceased. Family members gathered at the tomb, brought food and wine, ate together in the presence of the dead, and left offerings on or near the burial structure for the deceased to consume spiritually. Some Roman tombs were equipped with tubes, libation pipes, running from the surface down to the burial urn, through which family members poured wine, oil, or honey directly to the dead. The dead, in Roman understanding, retained needs. Thirst and hunger persisted, beyond death. Feeding the dead was not metaphor, it was logistics. Wealthy families built elaborate tomb complexes along the roads outside Roman cities, the Via Appia outside Rome being the most famous, lined with funerary monuments of escalating grandeur that turned the approach to the city into a continuous exhibition of family history and financial ambition. These tombs were designed for use by the living as much as for the commemoration of the dead, equipped with dining rooms, gardens, kitchens, and in some cases permanent staff whose job was to maintain the property and ensure the ongoing comfort of visitors who came to eat, drink, and remember. A funerary endowment might specify exactly which dates called for which meals, how many attendees were to be fed, what wine was to be served, and what the occasion called for in terms of flowers and additional decoration. The dead were, in this sense, continuing to host. The wealthy also left specific bequests in their wills to fund ongoing memorial banquets, not just for family but for the wider community, for members of professional associations and burial clubs, for the residents of a town or neighbourhood who would be invited to a feast in the deceased's honour on the anniversary of their death. This was generosity with a transparent self-interest. The more people ate and drank at your memorial, the more thoroughly you were remembered, and memory in Rome was the closest available approximation of immortality. The feast was the monument made edible, the legacy distributed in portions, the names spoken over wine by people who might not otherwise have had occasion to speak it. What all of this reveals is a civilization that did not believe the dead simply vanished. They persisted in memory, in obligation, in the ongoing need for food and wine and the company of the living. The wealthy Roman who planned his funeral, endowed his tomb, specified his memorial feasts, and arranged for the libation pipes to be maintained was not being morbid. He was being thorough. Death, in Rome, was simply the beginning of a much longer and considerably less mobile social career. The parties continued, the wine flowed into the ground, and somewhere along the Via Appia the dead kept excellent company. And so, here we are. At the end of a very long, very rich, very complicated day in ancient Rome. You woke before sunrise to a crowd of people waiting outside your door. You put on a garment that required 2 assistants and the structural confidence of a man who had never sneezed in public. You ate bread. You sat through the salutatio. You went to the forum and performed your importance for several hours in front of people who were performing their importance right back at you. You bathed with a senator. You attended a dinner party that lasted until midnight, ate a dormouse glazed in honey, drank wine that had been boiled in lead vessels, listened to a philosopher explain the virtue of simplicity between the acrobat and the second course, and then reclined on a couch for so long that one side of your body stopped working properly. You kept a moray eel. You named it. You loved it, perhaps more than you loved several of your clients. And through all of it, through the marble and the garum and the carefully arranged folds of the toga, and the fish pond and the wax ancestor masks walking in the funeral procession, and the libation pipes feeding wine to the dead along the Via Appia, through all of it, you were anxious, because Rome was always watching, and Rome never really approved of anything for long. Take a breath. You can stop performing now. Because here is what is easy to miss, underneath all the spectacle and the satire and the shared sponge that we all wish we hadn't learned about. The Romans were people, genuinely, recognizably, frustratingly human people, navigating a world of extraordinary beauty and structural violence and considerable uncertainty, trying to build something that would last beyond them and occasionally succeeding in ways that still take the breath away. They built the Pantheon. They wrote the Aeneid. They constructed roads across mountains and aqueducts across valleys, and legal frameworks that still run invisibly beneath the surface of the modern world's understanding of rights and governance, and what a civilization owes its citizens. They did all of this while also keeping named fish, wearing impractical clothing, and worrying about what the neighbours thought of their mosaics. Both things were true simultaneously. That's what people are like. And the people at the bottom of all that wealth, the enslaved men and women who carried the litters and scraped the strigils and cooked the dormice and maintained the libation pipes and remembered the names of people their owners couldn't be bothered to remember, they were people too. More people, in fact, than the histories recorded. Their names are mostly gone. Their labour is in every building. That's still standing. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, in your temperature-controlled room, with your plumbing that works in ways no Roman philosopher ever dreamed of, and your food that has been stored in a cold box rather than fermented in the sun, maybe spare a thought for all of them. For the senator anxious about his toga, for the cook producing 6 courses in a smoke-filled kitchen, for the nomenclator whispering names into ears at dawn, for the philosopher trying to hit the right register between interesting and employed, for the woman whose ornatrix spent 2 hours constructing her hair with pins and prayer, for the man weeping beside a fish pond. They were ridiculous and magnificent and terrible and creative and desperately, endlessly human, all at once, in a city that smelled of frankincense and the Tiber and other things we won't specify. History is not a clean story. It never was. But it is, if you look at it right, an extraordinarily vivid one. Sleep well. The toga can wait until morning.